that came about with some serendipity, I must say, and that the original contact I had was with a friend of mine who posted something on Facebook saying a couple of places on a Brazil trip, anybody interested? This friend of mine is called Sujan Chatterjee, who's based in Calcutta in Bengal. I showed this message to my wife. She said, find out about it. I got a response from Sujan fairly quickly afterwards, and there we were on our way to Brazil some 3 or 4 months later. You'll all know where Brazil is, of course. And the trip itself was fairly convoluted and very interesting from that point of view. And that we flew in to Rio via Amsterdam, flew from Rio via Brasilia to Manaus up here, where we spent 3 days in Manaus and then 5 days cruising on the Amazon River. From there we flew back to Rio via Brasilia again, and then took ourselves out to a place called Itasia, which is in Rio province, just down here. From there back to Rio, flew from there via Belo Horizonte out to Cuiabá, which is in the Mato Grosso and Pantanal region of Brazil. And out there we spent some 7 or 8 days before flying back then to Sao Paulo in the south, to Paris, and then back to Manchester. All a very interesting trip, convoluted and great fun. So I say, you all know where Brazil is. A couple of facts about the country. It's 3.2 million square miles. I don't know how many whales as that is. Population of 211 million. There are 1,832 bird species recorded in Brazil, of which 238 are endemic. Now, clearly this trip would only scratch the surface of the birds of Brazil, and it wasn't simply a birding trip. It was birds, habitat, environment, and mammals, of course. But even so, in the 3+ weeks we were there, we managed to see 392 bird species, which wasn't too bad. I just have to say there that the group that we joined had previously been in Peru for 10 days. And when we left them, they were heading off to Colombia for another 7 days. So their trip was even more interesting than ours. We had our first welcome in Rio from one of the residents, from the locals. We'd had a long outward journey, chilled out in Rio for a day, and then flew up to Manaus. And this was our first view of the Amazon. I have to say that many of us might have misgivings about taking internal flights in places like Brazil, but the airlines were absolutely superb. Very well organised, very good aircraft, very cheap, very easy to book tickets left, right and centre. So Manaus, I don't know how many of you heard of Manaus. I have to confess, before we went on this trip, I'd never heard of it before. As I say, this is the first view of the Amazon we had flying into Manaus. And you'll see this is Manaus, which sits on, strictly it sits on the Rio Negro. Because just south of Manaus, where the Rio Negro joins the other rivers flowing in from the south, that is actually where the Amazon is formed. Manaus is the capital of the Amazonas region of Brazil, which is huge, embraces most of the the Brazilian Amazon rainforest, has a population of 2.3 million. It's 1,250 kilometers from the Atlantic coast. And yet between Manaus and the Atlantic, there is not one bridge that crosses the Amazon, believe it or not. And the river, even upriver from Manaus, is still considerably wide despite it being so far inland. So whilst in Manaus, we spent a couple of days there, and we went out on a little expedition here and there to see some of the specialities of the region. This wasn't really one of them, it's just another insect that crops up as you wander around. A nice little cricket. I've no idea what species it actually is. This is the first bird that we encountered. Pleasant little thing known as the musician wren. This bird occurs. This area is actually on the southern edge of its range, and this we encountered in one of the national parks called the Presidente Figueiredo National Park. Please excuse my Portuguese pronunciation. It's nothing like as good as my Spanish, which is dreadful. Another bird we encountered in this national park was the ferruginous backed antbird, pleasantly sitting there next to a walkway. And a tiny hawk, which is actually a little, I believe it's an exhibitor, but I'm not quite sure, because as you'll know, in the Americas they call all kinds of birds hawks that may not be hawks, and maybe hawks and might be buzzards, and who can tell whatever else. But in this park we then went for a short walk to see another speciality species. Short walk. This is a picture that my wife took when we were at the end of this short walk. We went over 3 hillsides, down 2 valleys, and forded 2 streams. It took us about 4 kilometres. Now, as you can see, I'm wonderfully refreshed, as is my colleague. Not out of breath or feeling absolutely jiggered at all. But what did we come to see? Well, it was one of these. A cock of the rock, which we've all seen pictures of before, and I believed I'd seen the bird before. But of course, as I looked at it more closely, I realised the bird that I'd seen previously is an Andean cock of the rock, and this is a Guianean cock of the rock. A splendid bird, I have to say, and probably worth the walk in order to have seen it. But it was a long and exhausting walk, and thankfully we didn't have too many of those in the rest of the trip. Other birds knocking around there, such as this black-billed thrush. Vultures. One of the features in Brazil are plenty of vultures, all the same pretty well, being either black vulture or turkey vulture. And here you can see one of each. The turkey vulture is the upper one with the red head and the see-through nostril. The lower one, the black vulture with the black head. A slightly closer view of it here. So again, in Manaus, we then visited. Other birds. We saw this variable chachalaca. This is a whole family of birds that they're a bit like tree pheasants, you might almost say, with interesting communication. Our very first toucan of the trip, in a channel-billed toucan. And the first mammal that we saw of the trip. That's this beast. Not a great photograph, I'm afraid. The photography or the light was particularly poor, and the photographer was even poorer. Well, this is a howler monkey. I can't tell you which species of howler monkey, I'm afraid. But this is the noise that they make. Amazon River, these could often be heard in the mornings at round about dawn. Pleasant way to wake up with this noise in your ear. Makes a change from the normal noises in your ear in the morning. And then one of the first flycatchers that we had here. Now, flycatcher embraces a whole suite of species, and particularly in the near tropics. Most of the flycatchers in South America are actually tyrant flycatchers, or the Tyrannidae, of which there are about 80 species. These are nothing like flycatchers that we know of in Europe and possibly even in Asia. They're quite specific to mainly to Central and South America, and to a lesser extent to North America. And also you encounter, toady flycatcher, which is another of the tyrant flycatchers. A delightful bird. If any of you have ever seen or seen pictures of toadies, which are tiny little birds common to the Central Americas, and these toady flycatchers are very similar to those in size, but not at all related. They are truly tyrant flycatchers. And rails. Didn't see many of this kind of bird on the trip at all, because the habitat allows them a great opportunity to keep hiding away. So we went into the Parque do Mindo, which is seemingly a famous park in Manaus. People love to gather, and this is the local art on display there. This thing was about 60-70 feet tall, quite impressive. Shows a local native and jaguars and fish, and emerging from his egg, which is the animistic religion that existed there some time ago. I won't bore you with lunches, but this was one of the first of many absolutely splendid lunches that we had in Brazil, and this was the group that we were with. All from India, of different parts of India as well, some from Mumbai, some from Calcutta, some from Pune, which is outside Mumbai, and joined later from one from Germany. A great bunch of people, some excellent photographers, and great fun was had by all. At least I hope so. And this is our local guide, a man called Samuel, who was an Amazon native, but also a ground agent, particularly good at organising anything that might need organising in this part of the world. He seemed to know everybody in Manaus virtually. This is the science park where we visited a little later, again also in Manaus. And here they have recuperation programs for various animals, including these, which are manatees. They look like they're in terrible state at the moment, at that stage rather. They were actually just cleaning the tank out, which they do about 2 or 3 times a week. These animals unfortunately have been injured or damaged by propellers on craft and such like, and they're in the process of recuperation before, if possible, being re-released into the Amazon with very high rates of success. White-tipped dove, which is one of the very common birds in the area, once again. And I have to emphasize that actually probably in the Amazon region we saw mostly what for them are common birds, what for us are very exotic, of course. Well, this is again a lovely bird to see. And these things, which are almost everywhere, are agoutis. These are like an equivalent of rabbits or hares there. They make good eating apparently, so they're quite popular with the locals when they can be caught, in the same way that rabbits and hares used to be popular with us in years gone past. A grey-breasted martin, that accompanied us pretty well everywhere. That there was some water around, because we were there in their summer. So the martins were around and were breeding, of course. In the centre of Manhouse, where we went down to after we'd had our couple of days doing some local birding and cultural visits, there's the market where we had to go and get our supplies for our journey upriver. This is an absolutely fascinating place. As you might guess, fish is the absolute staple of food around the Amazon, and of course it's all freshwater fish, and seemingly very abundant. This was, I say, a huge market inside, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stalls, all selling their own specialities, some just selling fish like this, some sold one kind of fish or one kind of eel, or one kind of vegetable. This one was quite a myriad of displays, but there were some who simply sold avocados, for example. Some that sold simply watermelons. A bustling, very, very friendly place though, and seemingly very clean. As you may know, Manaus is one of the places in Brazil that's been very, very badly hit by the COVID outbreak this year. But at that time, we were unaware of any of such problems about to present themselves to us. The seafront at Manaus is fascinating, as you'll see. Oh, I say the seafront rather, it's a waterfront, a riverfront in fact, full of boats, and these are almost exclusively ferries, and ferries are the normal mode of transport on the Amazon. You can see these 3-deck vessels which ply their trade up and down, and people use these to travel from their towns or villages to get to Manaus, which I say is the big city where everything will be bought and sold that's needed. And you can see the cloaks up here, and on that upper deck, all those things hanging from the ceiling are actually hammocks. And the ferry journey to Manaus from the places upriver is 3 or 4 days. So people will be on board these ferries, feeding themselves, sleeping, dozing, and happily enjoying themselves. But I say the whole harbour front is hustle and bustle, and seemingly very friendly, and there didn't seem to be any outward security issues there at all. And this was our vessel. This is the mighty Cruzador, or Cruzador rather, in Portuguese. As you can see, it's huge, and 15 of us slept, ate and lived on here for 5 days, and great fun was had by all. We were fortunate. We had the VIP cabin, which was this. It had a double bed, and it had a form of ensuite bathroom. You pumped the water by foot, which came out of the river from somewhere. You didn't drink it, obviously. You washed and sluiced with it and made the best of it. And we all slept very well on board. Humidity was quite high, but we didn't really need to use the aircon. Temperature was in the 30s most of the time, which from the perspective of a Huddersfield January sounds quite pleasant, isn't it? And you'll see this was a galley, tiny galley, and the lady who worked in here produced amazing meals for us all, including a couple of vegetarians and one vegan. Produced meals to suit everybody, even including me, and I don't eat fish, so you can imagine how awkward I was to feed. This is the dining room. 15 of us ate in here. It was cosy but fun. So there's some birds drifting about the harbour. This is a fairly common one. Less of a yellow-headed vulture. There's also a greater yellow-headed vulture, but I failed to capture its photograph. I'd say a few birds, but only 1 or 2 around the harbour. This is one of the commonest on the harbour and up the river, which is a yellow-headed caracara. It's actually a falcon, but feeds and behaves like a vulture. It's a scavenger. And these can be seen throughout Southern America, and certainly throughout the eastern part of Southern America. They, I say, they're a common bird, accompanied us quite frequently. This, believe it or not, is a gas station. These 2 or 3 of these just right in the middle of the river, and where else would you get your fuel from? You don't want to come into port to fuel up, so you just call in at this place. They plug you in, fill up a couple of 100 gallons of whatever your favourite gas is, hand across your credit card, and away you go. So off we're headed, upriver. This is a typical lunch stop just outside Manhouse. It was actually atypical because these kind of tourist places and eating places were only present, as it happened, just around Manhouse. And once you got further upriver, they weren't present at all. We were feeding ourselves from our own provisions, but we ate in one of these on the first day, and it was very pleasant. And associated with the boat, the cruisador, were 2 of these canoes, as they were called, aluminium hulls with outboard motors, and these were used to go hunting for birds and animals up and down the channels at the side of the river. And this was our first experience of using these boats. To say, the river cruise itself was hugely enjoyable. It was fairly bird-light to some extent, in the total of the 8 days in the Amazonas, that's in Manaus and on board the boat, we saw 135 species, which is a lowish number, and most of these were relatively common species. But of course, we weren't within the Amazon forest itself, we were on the river, and so most of the things we saw were those associated with these riverine environments. Had we gone on treks into the forest, we would have seen many more, would have encountered many other things as well, in particular a lot of very hungry insects. Once we got away from Manaus, we passed no further towns at all. You can see again, this is tripped out on these boats. Most of the people on the trip were keen photographers, some keener than others, and so many photographs were captured like this and like others. So here's the first reasonably interesting bird. Again, as it turns out, we thought it was quite a special bird. It's a fairly common member of the puffbird family, as it turns out, known as a black-fronted nunbird. Again, an interesting bird to see. I didn't see very many of them, common bird though it might be. As I said, the birds were relatively few in number. The almost ubiquitous now great white egret, or great egret as it tends to be called. Many of these seen on the riverside. This quite delightful bird, fork-tailed flycatcher. Once again, this is a tyrant flycatcher, which grows this huge tail, which serves no purpose other than for display and for mating. Must interfere hugely with its ability as a flycatcher. But again, as I say, a delightful bird to see. Locally very common. Often where you saw one, you would see half a dozen. But once again, not a rare bird in this particular area. This is an interesting bird. This is the cockeye heron. It's widely distributed throughout South America, It is the largest of the South American herons. It's about half as tall again as a grey heron, which it superficially resembles, I suppose. Even bigger than the blue herons that you get in Northern America. Quite an obliging bird. Didn't fly away whenever you picked up your camera, which was why we got plenty of very pleasant photographs of it. This is probably the most common raptor throughout South America, Southern America, should I say. This is a roadside hawk. It's a small raptor, but almost every bird that you see, in the same way if you go to Asia, you see shikra left, right and centre. Almost every raptor you see in a bush or a tree in Southern America is a roadside hawk, but you still can't stop yourself taking a look and wondering what it is to confirm the fact that yes, it's another roadside hawk. Nice bird though. This again, common bird, but pleasant to see. I know a few of you who visited Central, Southern America or the islands have seen jacanas. They're not uncommon, and wattled jacana is probably the most common of the family in the Central and Southern Americas. What you will see with them is these huge feet, enormous feet, and this allows them to walk on any area where there is floating vegetation, whether it be lily pads or any other kind of thing. But a pleasant enough bird to see, as is this. And again, it's a common bird, but it's a gold-winged parakeet. And the parakeets were something that were quite a delight to a number of our colleagues on the trip, because they were very keen on all things related to parrots, parakeets, macaws, and anything else that of this ilk that might be seen there. Of course, in Southern America, there are many of the parrot family to be seen. This bird, which is absolutely delightful, I have to say, it's called a white-winged swallow. A lovely bird, tiny, bright and shimmering, and yet again, very, very common. Wherever you are near to a river in this, which is the austral summer, you would see flocks of these birds around, and they would land next to you, land on the prow of the boat. But lovely markings, and as I say, quite delightful no matter how many times you saw them. So what we did to look for animals, mainly birds, but hopefully other animals, caiman, turtles, anything else we might encounter, we would go on these canoe cruises. And at times they seem to resemble Heart of Darkness, if you've read the book, where you're cruising along very quietly on extremely quiet, slightly sinister creeks and small rivers. And as you might imagine, the river level varied enormously through the year. We were there in a very wet season, so we had no issues. Again, we had no issues with piranha, which some people might wonder about. Do you encounter piranha in the Amazon? And the answer is yes, you can see piranha in the Amazon, and they are completely and totally harmless. They do not attack people. They do not strip down livestock in 2 minutes or anything like that. Their reputation is completely unmerited. Seemingly the only times they can be dangerous is in times of drought, when they get trapped in small pools. They spend most of the time eating each other. Anyway, piranhas were around. I've got no photos of them. Didn't get attacked by them. Didn't even get a nibble. This is typical of the trees that you will find though in these parts of the Amazon. As you can see, these are magnificent beasts. Absolutely huge. The thickest species, I can't tell you. what the particular species is. But they have these huge buttresses and yet incredibly shallow roots, as you might imagine, because the roots are waterlogged most of the time. So the roots and the buttress has to grow very quickly wherever there's a patch of daylight, because the first tree that reaches the daylight is the tree that dominates the canopy, of course. Further up the river, we were taken to something I personally have misgivings about, I must admit, which was a dolphinarium. Now, I don't like the concept of captive animals at the best of time and captive cetaceans, least of all. But we were told this was an Amazon dolphinarium, and that it was harmless. Well, as it turned out, it was correct. These are Amazon river dolphins. I don't know, some of you may have seen a river dolphin in your travels around the world, but there are only 4 species of river dolphin extant now in the world. And this one, the Amazon river dolphin, is the largest. Now, as you can see, this lovely orange pink colour that it appears to be is actually very deceptive. It's called the pink dolphin, but it is not pink, it's grey. But the colour that you see is actually from the colour of the water itself. But these dolphins are not captive. This dolphinarium, as they call it, is just a floating, or not really floating, an anchored home where this lady and her family live, and they feed the dolphins. The dolphins live in the river and they come to her for food now and then when she decides to come out with a bucket of fish, which of course is whenever she's got a suitable number of tourists there to join her in feeding these animals. So, as I say, they are completely wild and thankfully harmless. And you can see them being fed here, and you can see the actual colour of the animals properly. As I say, below the water it looks pink or orange, but its real colour is revealed above water as being grey. Sorry. With tremendous beak. They're very efficient fishes, apparently, and they are reasonably stable in number in the Amazon, unlike many other river dolphins, and apparently they're not threatened at the moment. Thankfully, the Amazon is a big enough river to offer them sufficient room to thrive. So then we move on, looking for more birds, and we come across this, which is again one of the big woodpeckers. If you've seen pileated woodpecker or similar things in North America or Central America, this is one of the big birds, the big woodpeckers, crimson crested woodpecker. But again, is relatively common, but no less pleasurable or delightful to see. And these, to the inexperienced, such as I, these can take a bit of identifying. Similarly, this rather poor picture of a straight-billed wood creeper. There's a huge number of wood creepers in South America. They're quite difficult to separate. The experienced eye will separate them quite quickly, normally depending upon habitat, region, and of course markings. And again, this one is one of the commoner of the wood creepers, but again, no less pleasurable to see. But there weren't just birds to see. As I say, we were looking for other things, and we came across more than one sloth. And this is a 3-toed sloth. We only saw 3-toed sloths on this trip. We didn't see any 2-toed sloths. And these are apparently readily identified by the fact that they have a tail. The 2-toed sloth does not have a tail. The 3-toed sloth does so. Excuse me. Sloths, as we know, are slow movers, and they also have incredibly slow metabolisms. I don't know who studied this, but it is said that a leaf will take 4 weeks to pass through the 4-chambered stomach and digestion, which is an incredible period of time. And they descend from the canopy once a week, approximately, to defecate, at which point they can lose 1/3 of their body mass. I think we all know how that can feel sometimes, but not once a week. And we did see, say, a reasonable number of these animals. They're a pleasure to see. They're completely harmless, and thankfully they don't appear to be hunted extensively, because obviously the natives in the jungle hunt the wildlife. That's what they live on. But apparently the sloths carry some sort of mystic connotations. You also get more howler monkeys. I believe this is a different species to the one that I had a picture of earlier, but I can't tell you, I'm afraid. And another interesting fact about howler monkeys is that they are considered to be the loudest land mammals on Earth. I'm not surprised when you hear them. We went searching for caiman. Our guide Samuel was desperate to show us caiman on the Amazon. As we would learn later in the Pantanal, searching for caiman is something that you don't really need to do. But we spent a lot of time in our canoes, driving up and down the river edges, going up and down channels, searching for caiman. And here we were. We did eventually find one on the second night, and Samuel was absolutely delighted to show this beast to us. And I have to say, it was 14 inches long, and you could only see it because of the little pink eyes staring out at you from the undergrowth. But he was pleased, so we were pleased for him. And we would return then to the ship, the Cruzador, which would be anchored somewhere suitable, pleasant enough to see a green ibis heading into roost in the shadows in the evening. And there would be our typical nighttime anchorage. And in the nighttime we get the lovely sunset. So I have to say, I've seen many sunsets in many places, but the sunsets on the Amazon were consistently great. And of course, what do you have with a sunset? What do you have? A sundowner. And this drink, traditional Brazilian drink, is known as a caipirinha, and is absolutely lethal. It's made of cachaça, which is a type of rum, they say, made from sugar cane, with sugar and lime juice and crushed ice added. A couple of those, you would sleep very well. Waken the next morning to the dawn, just waken with the light, go out on board at dawn, and find the ship was surrounded by nightjars and nighthawks. Very hard to photograph, as you might imagine, because the light's only just coming up. And there were literally hundreds of these flying around the ship. And there was a little bit of light around the ship, obviously, which was attracting insects, and these were feeding from them. I was assured by our guide that this was a blackish nightjar. How to tell the difference in this light, I don't know, but we did see 3 types we confirmed eventually, which were lesser ladder-tailed and blackish nightjars and nighthawks. So then we went upriver, and we were going into the jungle that day. We were going on a jungle experience. As you can see, whilst up the channels, the side channels, with some watching and some tuggers, as we call them, or photographers, very keen on taking snaps or pictures of whatever we saw. And this chap here in the blue shirt was a local hunter, and we actually collected him from a village, close by. It turned out this was both for our welfare. More likely it was politically astute to involve local villagers in what we were doing. He was paid a relatively small fee that he was delighted with, and it would seem that the amount of money we paid him would save him from catching a tapir that day. So you could say we saved a tapir. And we were going up into the jungle, as I say, to experience some of the habitat there and some of the interesting sights and sounds. One particularly interesting thing, and I didn't twig this at first, was the fact that we were going through the channels and seeing these lumps on the sides of black lumps on the sides of trees, and what I thought were dragonflies whistling past my head all the time. It turned out that if you look closely at this branch, you will actually see that these are bats, tiny, tiny, long-nosed bats. They're literally 2 or 3 inches tall, and as you went past them, these would fly off the branches, but they're so small they look like insects. The time I twigged this, I only managed to get this one photo, but then we found ourselves an interesting waterfall. I think these trips go to this particular waterfall every time. And as any of you who know Indians well will know, that show them somewhere where they can bathe and they will bathe. So all of our colleagues plunge themselves into this water to have a bathe. I mentioned this local guide, and this was a fascinating point, because he went for a walk in the water and climbed up the waterfall where the water was fresher and cleaner. And just to show you our colleagues there, this is the group there, and 1 or 2 of these guys attempted to climb the waterfall with him and failed. And he reached down, took hold of them by one of their arms and just picked them up. That waterfall was about 5 foot high, and he just plucked them out of the water and stood them on top of it. It's immensely strong. But this is what you get for living your life naturally and hunting, building your own house, and living the healthy life, I suppose. Anyway, some of us were more reserved, of course, and chose not to plunge ourselves into the water. We went up later into the jungle, and I have to say, the jungle is impenetrable to somebody who does not know it. There are no paths really that you can see at all, no tracks. If anybody got more than 10 meters away from you, you would be lost, absolutely lost. But Samuel took us into the jungle and demonstrated a number of jungle crafts. And he had a panga and various knives with him. And he showed us how to make sunshades, showed us how to make thatch, he showed us how to make bows and arrows and such like, all of which literally he cut from branches, twigs, and these various plants growing in the jungle. Absolutely fascinating. Then he took us for lunch. The fish had been caught by his men earlier that day. He built the grill that they were going to be cooked upon. You can see them being cooked here. I was told these were delicious fresh fish. I told you I don't like fish, so I didn't have any. And we had pineapples, plantains. All of this took about an hour to cook, as you might imagine. So we've been lolling about, sunning ourselves or just resting. And even the utensils that we used to eat our lunch with, he made whilst he was doing this. Chopped a couple of leaves off, pulled a couple of thorns out of the side of the tree, sticks the leaves together, sliced a bit off a tree and made spoons out of them. What these people can do with absolutely nothing was fascinating. And then we had, this took all day, of course, it seemed very quick, but we had one more. Amazon sunset. I won't show you any more pictures of Caipirinha, but I can assure you we had a couple more that evening. So that was the northern extent of the trip on the river. And believe it or not, we began our return journey. This again was a relatively common parakeet. This is a peach-fronted parakeet, accompanied by a dragonfly. This is a very fortuitous photograph. I can claim to have spent a lot of time trying to catch this dragonfly at the same time as a parakeet, but I wouldn't be telling the truth. Another interesting bird. I know at least one person listening to this has seen troupials before, but this particular one is an orange-backed troupial, which are noisy creatures. Once heard, never forgotten. Black-collared hawk, which we saw a couple of on the trip, which were quite interesting. We were quite excited to see these birds because they were at the northern extent of their range. When we went into the Pantanal later, we saw literally hundreds of these on a daily basis. These little things, squirrel monkeys, you have to believe that the one on the back is the baby and the one carrying it is the mother. But that is what they are. These are apparently Gollin's squirrel monkey. Very confining animals. So clearly the locals don't find a lot of good eating on them. But if you took a boat to the edge of any channel, these monkeys would generally appear in the leaves to inspect you and find out what you were up to. The near-tropical cormorant, again, in Southern America, quite a common bird, but in actual fact, we saw very few of these on the Amazon itself. We saw a lot more in the Pantanal later. This here is a masked titira or titira. I'm never sure how the name is pronounced. And this is another of the puff birds. So I showed you the nun bird earlier, which is one kind of puff bird. This is a different one. Bird, as I say. And then we're still on our long cruise back to Manaus. This is the Rio Negro heading back to Manaus. We're 1,400 kilometers from the coast here, and the river is 11 or 12 kilometers wide. It's hard to contemplate or understand how wide the Negro or the Amazon is. Just a massive body of water. Then we even have an Amazon rainbow for just a change. And our last Amazon sunset before heading back on the last short bit of the trip to Manaus. I mentioned the tyrant flycatchers before, and quite a number of these are seen as you get closer to habitation. This one's a dusky-capped flycatcher, which you will have all recognised. This one's a streak flycatcher, belying its name by not catching flies. And this is a variegated flycatcher. The difference between those two is not immediately obvious at first, but you pick it up eventually. Amazon kingfisher, which again I would have expected to see a lot of. We saw a few, but once more, many more in places away from the Amazon or the Negro itself. And this fascinating bird is a bare-necked fruit crow. It's the only member of its genus. It's actually part of the Cotinga family. It's widespread, and yet very little is known about it. Very little is known about its either its breeding biology or its migratory ecology. And the only anybody might call seabird of the trip. Sorry about this, Mike. I didn't avoid them deliberately, but we saw no gulls whatsoever. Didn't go looking for them in Rio, I must admit, but all along the Amazon, this is the only seabird that we saw, which is the large-billed tern. Lovely bird, though. And there we were, back to Manaus, the Manaus Riverscape. Into Manaus onto a minibus, down to the airport, threw our luggage onto an aircraft, flew to Brasilia, and back to Rio from Brasilia. We had a day to chill out in Rio. We all know about Rio, don't we? So our Indian friends, being completely unfazed by any of this, called up a couple of Uber taxis on the day's gap we had there. We took ourselves down to the botanical gardens in Rio, complete with Swarovski optics and Nikon cameras and large lenses, such like. And I have to say, we encountered not the slightest glance or problem whatsoever. Rio itself is seemingly a nice city. If you stay away from the wrong places at the wrong times, you should not have any problems. The botanical gardens itself was fascinating. A few bird species, mostly of the kind that sit in the highest canopies, prinias and peewees and things like this. But there were the plants stood still, which was one good thing. Also had the classical view, of course, you have to have in Rio, which the view of Christ the Redeemer sitting there on the hillside dominating the city. Botanical gardens, obviously, had interesting flowers. I know some people like flowers, so here they are. These are rather nice orchids, different types. And a huge array of cacti. And of course, you're in South America, which is the home of the cacti. And here they are. So we spent a pleasant day, taking in the warnings about the dangers of mosquitoes and the dangers of malaria. And 10 minutes can save lives, it says here. All the different things you can do to protect yourself from malaria. The thing that we did to protect ourselves was being there at the time of year when there are no mosquitoes around, which was wonderful planning and very wise on our part. Again, another picture of the botanical gardens. If ever you get to visit Rio, do go there. It's well worthwhile. It costs you about 25 pence to get in. And you can spend a very pleasurable day there looking at a whole host of plants and picking up a few bird species as well. There's an artistic photograph taken on a phone. So then we head off from the midpoint of the journey to a place called Itasha. That's how you pronounce that. Now, Itasha is a completely different kind of habitat to the Amazonas region. It's in Rio province. It contains the one of the few areas of remnant Atlantic rainforest, and it's also at reasonably high altitude when you get to the main bird watching areas themselves. Here's an example of a cow herd, which must be one of the easiest jobs going. You sit on your horse and trot along quietly, and all the cows follow you in for their milking. They're not exactly resistant. An interesting thing with this area, though, the Itasha area, and this particular place called Pirai, is it's much more interesting from a birding point of view, much more birdy in general than the Amazonas region. So we saw, just standing here by the roadside, we picked up 24 different bird species, most of which I failed to photograph. There's your cattle again, sorry. Another puffbird, a white-eared puffbird in this case. We saw 3 different puffbirds just in this region, but I just picked up this particular one on camera anyway. This bird that I've never heard of before, I don't know if any of the rest of you have, but this is called a firewood gatherer. And its name comes quite specifically from the way it builds nests. And it builds nests out of literally piles of sticks, huge piles of sticks. Yet this bird itself is smaller than a blackbird, but it spends 9 months of the year building nests, it would appear. The male builds a nest that the female has to approve of. spends most of his time building them, and builds them in very obvious places as well. And they're also quite noisy, and they sing together. The other interesting thing with this bird is it's monotypic, so it's not in any other family or genus, at least so far, as far as the DNA analyses have led to believe. This here is a streamer-tailed tyrant. You remember seeing the flycatcher earlier, scissor-tail flycatcher. This is a streamer-tailed tyrant. Look very similar in fact. Same family, obviously, because it's a tyrant flycatcher again, but lives in a completely different habitat. But once again, very confiding bird. Better photograph up on there. And this is a bird from a very interesting family, a wing-banded hornero, also called band-tailed hornero. This is actually at the northernmost point of its range. And this is hornero. You might know a little bit of Spanish, but this is an oven bird, so called because of the nests that they build. And this is not at all to be confused with the oven bird of the United States, which is a thrush. But the oven birds I'll talk to you about next year when you listen to the second part of the presentation, when we visit the Pantanal. This here is a lovely bird. Poor photograph of the lovely bird, but it's a saffron toucanet. It's a near threatened species. It's more of a aracari than a toucan. And this here, not boring you with just a list of birds, but is a Surakur trogon. Never seen one in my life before, and this was the only trogon species that we saw in the whole of this trip to Brazil, and has a call fairly typical of trogons. And so we moved on. We moved on via one or two other birds. Savannah hawk, which again is typical, slightly out of its normal range here. And we finally arrive at our hotel.ip in Itácia. As you can judge by these the roofs of these buildings, it's not the driest part of the world. Fortunately, we weren't there in rainy season, their rainy season. But it's also at 2,100 meters, so much colder than it was in the Amazon. And it meant that walking up to your room and walking back again was a work of art. You were panting and blowing after 2 or 3 minutes. And fleeces were the order of the day. It's a place with fabulous views. That's just one example. Gazing across these mountain sides. And as you can see, habitat entirely different from that in the Amazon. And one of the greatest problems here was actually trying to eat lunch or even an early dinner, because the dining room was surrounded by bird feeders, upon which you would find such as this, and I'm only going to give you a taster here. This is a green-headed tanager. This is a Brazilian ruby. That's a male, and that's a rather dull-looking female. Rufous-collared sparrows, which you'll have seen plenty of if you've been to Central America, but still pleasant and confiding. And this here, the frilled coquette, which was actually one of the target birds in Itácia, and we only saw this on our last day there. A speciality bird of the region, a delightful little hummingbird, and again I have to say, we saw no hummingbirds whatsoever in the Amazon, because you don't get hummingbirds in that kind of habitat. You only get them when you start getting into reasonable altitude. A lovely bird. And as I say, I'm now going to leave you there in Itasha, and this will be continued sometime next year